Hi everyone, welcome to this session about being agile with Microsoft Project. A very intriguing title and also very hot topic in terms of using Microsoft Project for agile projects. We heard some
Hi, this is Steve Casely from Sensei Project Solutions, just doing a quick sound check to see if anyone is able to hear me. Hello, this is Steve Casely from Sensei Project Solutions. Is there any way you can indicate if you can hear me? If I don't hear in a moment or two, I'm going to actually exit and I will exit the Hangout and try reloading to see if that helps. Okay, I'm going to exit and reload.
Hey Steve, I'm back.
Okay, I'm back as well. I don't know if where the problem was, but hopefully we're back on track.
Yes, I think we are. So we're still broadcasting. So I think you can share your screen.
Okay.
So you can bring up your PowerPoint again.
Okay.
Okay.
So I should be good to go then?
Yes. So I'm checking the session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Casely from Sensei Project Solutions. Sorry for that very slight technical hiccup at the beginning. I'm not quite sure what happened, but hopefully all is well and we're ready to begin. I'm here to discuss being agile with Microsoft Project. As Prasanna said in the introduction, probably a very hot topic and a very intriguing topic because those of you who have been using Microsoft Project in the past probably perceive Microsoft Project as a very traditional waterfall tool based on large complex projects with thousands of lines of tasks and hundreds of resources. and complex schedules with dependencies. And Agile is all about being none of the above. Agile is all about developing your projects with a series of incremental iterations or sprints and incremental evolution of the work, i.e. the stories in a project as the project progresses. So can we in fact be agile with Microsoft Project? And I'd like to suggest the answer is yes, but we have to use the features and functions of Microsoft Project that allows us to be agile. And as a matter of fact, we need to extend the features and functions of Microsoft Project just a little bit. We need to use some extra fields, forms, and tables to add in extra functionality to be agile. And we literally have to ignore some of the features and functions of Microsoft Project, such as auto leveling and scheduling, because that really isn't needed in being agile. And I hope to show you that all in our presentation. So very quickly on myself, I've got a few gray hairs. I've been in this business for a number of years. I've got over 35 years experience. It's all been in IT consulting. So I've been in IT my entire life. Started off in the development ranks. I was a developer and a designer and analyst. Very quickly evolved into project management and absolutely loved what was happening in the project management field. And then over the last several years, I would say 5+ years, absolutely evolved towards the agile side of the fence and very much focused on how we can be very effective delivering agile, but in the same behalf, very focused on protecting investment in existing tools and protecting investment in organizational processes, which is why I'm very interested in using Microsoft Project as an agile tool. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold. So in our demonstration this morning, my main focus is to show you how we can be agile using Microsoft Project on the desktop. But my expectation is a lot of organizations have probably evolved their usage of tools beyond individual desktop tools and are looking at enterprise solutions. So although my focus today is on project desktop functionality for Agile, I will quickly explore how we can also move that over into an enterprise environment. And the Microsoft term for enterprises is Project Web App, PWA, Project Server, Project Online, a series of tools that we use interchangeably. But the focus is on how we can do things like product backlog, story grooming, burn down charts, iterative delivery within Microsoft Project on the desktop. And we have built a series of best practices and process guidance into Microsoft Project to allow us to ensure that we're following the right processes. And then finally, time permitting, we will have a very quick discussion on a term called Bi-Modal Delivery, which is a term coming from Gartner Group, where their focus is on ensuring that we have the ability to allow both traditional and iterative projects to be delivered in a common, consistent environment. But first and foremost is being agile inside Microsoft Project. And these screenshots that I'm showing here on the slide, and yes, we'll get into the tool here in just a couple of moments, are Microsoft Project tools. We have done some value add to Microsoft. We have done some fields and forms and tables and views and filters to allow us to capture all of the appropriate data that we need to be agile. And as you can see from the very top screenshot on the slide, we have done some value add of a series of toolbars. We have an Agile Analyzer toolbar, and the one that's visible right now is the Agile Report toolbar to make being agile inside Microsoft Project as easy, as flexible as possible, recognizing that, again, Microsoft Project is a very deep, complex tool. If we want to simplify the tool to support the, I'm going to say simplified, and I hope I'm not offending anyone in the audience that when I say that, the simplified agile processes, we thought it was also important to simplify the tool, which is why we chose to add in the toolbars to do that. Now, I will state, although I am showing a product that Sensei has available for sale, there is absolutely nothing magical that we have done that you cannot do yourself. When I say we have extended Microsoft Project, we have extended Microsoft Project using existing extendable functionality as defined by Microsoft. So we have created fields. Now, we call them custom fields because that's the terminology Microsoft uses, but we're simply using standard extension rules from Microsoft to create fields and tables and views and filters and so on. And the same thing applies. In terms of toolbar customization, we have simply used existing functionality supported by Microsoft. So A, everything you're seeing here, you can do yourself. And B, everything you're seeing here, you should have a very high degree of confidence that it's going to be supported on a go-forward basis because it is existing published functionality. And we all know that fields and forms and tables and views and filters have been supported by Microsoft since forever. And I certainly can't believe there's any risk that these aren't going to be supported on a go-forward basis. The key is, as I said, we're trying to make the tool as agile focused as possible. And that's why, again, we've created these specific views to keep you focused in the right areas to be agile. And we have absolutely focused on creating a series of reports that work within the confines, work within the definitions of what the Agile Alliance and Scrum.org define as being agile. So a little bit more deeper, if we look at the Agile ribbons itself, I'm now in the Agile Analyzer, we have a series of views on the left that allow us to be extremely agile. We have a Scrum Gantt chart, and the Scrum Gantt chart is very, very similar to a traditional Gantt chart in the Microsoft project, but we have added in a few filters to make sure that we're not picking up all of the extra components, i.e. all of the stories that are yet to be scheduled for development. So when we look at the Scrum Gantt chart, and we will in the tool, you're seeing just the stories that have been actively selected for completion in sprints. We'll see stories that are completed in prior sprints, and we'll see the stories that are selected to be developed in the current sprint, but we're not burdening the Gantt chart with all of the future stories that are a part of the product backlog. That's the purpose of the view we're showing right now, which is the product backlog, where in fact we are seeing only the stories that are yet to be developed, and that's based on a filter. If you wanted to see all stories, you could see that as well. So these are the stories that are yet to be developed. We have some stories that are tentatively planned for sprint number 3. We have very early placeholders for sprint number 4, release 2, sprints 1 and 2, and then we have an absolute backlog of stories that are yet to be even considered for when and how they're going to be released into our Agile project. I do most of my work inside this particular view called the product backlog because I like the way that it's presented and the way that I can understand how my stories are evolving into sprints. But there's another view that's a pure story list view that is simply a top to bottom list of every story that was ever invented in the particular project. And we have some further refinement that we can classify stories as epics, and then, classify business needs as epics, and then we can manage and categorize stories against the epics so that we can, again, validate how well we're solving the epic requirements and look and see when the epic is going to be resolved. We can track what's happening within our current sprint. We can look at the stories that are being done within the current sprint. We can break stories in the sprint down into tasks if we so desire, and we can do active management of that. And again, we'll see all of that in action in the tool. I just felt it was important to give a little bit of foundation of how we're doing this before we get dirty and inside the tool. We also have a series of story maintenance. So these are designed to help the product owner and or Scrum Master validate that the product backlog is progressing properly. So new stories would be used by the product owner to say, what new stories have been added into the system? What do I need to make sure that are going to be progressed through so that the story card gets developed, the definition of done gets developed, and the story is eventually ready to be scheduled? What are the stories that are in progress? What stories do I need to talk to my subject matter experts? We're getting very close to another sprint planning session. I think I need to get a few more of these stories moved forward so that they can be candidates for the next sprint. What are the stories that are ready? The business thinks the stories are ready. Let me, as the product owner, have one last look at them to make sure that they are as ready as my SMEs think they should be. What are the stories that are approved? This is a view that the project team would use to understand what stories should be considered for estimation, i.e. we need to develop our story point estimates. And finally, what are the stories that are absolutely done, as in ready for development, ready for scheduling into a sprint, so that we can actually consider them when we're doing our next sprint plan. And then finally, we have a series of validation processes simply to make sure that the rules are being followed, that someone isn't being a little lax with their processes and trying to get a story scheduled for a sprint that doesn't even have a story point assigned to it, for example. So absolutely a very focused view on how to be agile, and it's all based on following this specific process flow. So as I said, we start off with anybody and everybody has the ability to put stories into the system, and we put them in as placeholders. Product owner is going to come in and say, is this story appropriate? Is this story consistent with the project vision? Is this story consistent with where I want this project to go? Yes or no? If it's no, then we use the traditional pick the story card up and rip it up. Well, in Microsoft Project, we actually click the line and delete it. But assuming it's acceptable, we're then going to set it into progress. And then over time, the story type, the priority is set, the story card is developed, the definition of done is created, and the story evolves that it is ready. And then at some point in time, the SMEs, whoever is working on evolving the story, says, I think it's done. I believe I have a good story card as a type of user I need to. I believe the definition of done is satisfactory. I believe that if I hand this over to the project team, they should be able to estimate it. And again, with those all-important conversations during the actual sprint, they should be able to develop it. Product owner is going to come in and do a little validation check to make sure, yes, this is as complete as my SME thinks it is. And then we're going to hand off the stories. Everything in blue over here on the left is the focus of the business area. And then we hand it over to the project team, the Agile team. This story is ready for estimation. The team is going to look at it and do one last verification. Can I do a reasonable story point estimate? Is there enough detail in here that I can write the story with those all-important conversations? Is the definition of done adequate that I'm going to be able to test it? And they're going to say yes. So then, as needed, when needed, however your organization is going to do it, the story point estimates are going to be developed. So whether you're using Fibonacci or exponential and planning poker or FIST 5 or whatever estimation process you use, we will support all of them. The actual story point estimates are going to be created. And then the story is set. It's now ready. Dear product owner, when it's time to plan your next sprint, these are all of the stories that are ready. Product owner is going to assign them to a sprint, and the team is then going to start the sprint, the 2-week, the 3-week, the 4-week, however long your sprint is going to be, and work on it. So with that, I'd actually like to go into the tool and see all of this in action. So here we are inside Microsoft Project, and I have my toolbars active. Here's my Agile Analyzer toolbar and my report toolbar that we'll look at in just a few moments. At this point in time, I am in, as I said, my favorite view, which is the product backlog view. Here, I have turned off the filter I mentioned a moment ago that said I only wanted to look at the future story. So at this point in time, for the purpose of this discussion, I turned off that filter, and I am now looking at all stories, which is another key thing I will call out, that all of the functions that are available inside Microsoft Project, such as filtering, turning filters on, turning filters off, are 100% available to us because we are using raw Microsoft Project functionality. So sprint number 1 is done, and in the history book, I've got the tick box. This sprint is absolutely done. Sprint number 2 is the sprint that's actually in progress. And I have deliberately left the burning indicator, the fact that my resources are over allocated, to allow us to talk a little bit about how resource management can be done inside Microsoft Project for Agile. And the answer is, again, You can do it at whatever level of detail, whatever level of granularity that you like to be agile in your organization. My personal recommendation is I would actually try to get all of these burning indicators resolved. And maybe it's because I've got so many gray hairs and I've got a little bit of that traditional life in me as well. But I would like to know that I have reasonable belief that I can get these 3 stories done. Obviously, I have the belief that I can get these 3 stories done based on the story points, but also based on how the stories are assigned to the individual team members. So I would actually do resource assignments. I would put Tom and Mary and Sally on my stories, and I would understand what the relative work is going to be so that I can make sure that my team members have a hope of getting all of these 3 stories done in my 2-week sprint. But that's just me. The system will also work 100% perfectly if you don't even assign resources to your sprints or to your stories within the sprint, and you simply say, I'm going to let the team be absolutely agile. I'm going to let the team self-manage, and the team can, in their daily stand-ups, decide who's working on what their problems, what their issues, what their impediments are going to be, and move forward. So a very, very flexible approach. And we can support either strategy for resource management. I will put one more plug in for resource management and then move on. If you do assign the stories to resources and you then are using Microsoft Project in an enterprise world, when you publish your Microsoft Project schedules to your enterprise environment, to Project Server, Project Online, then all of those resource assignments are available to you at an enterprise level, so you can do better enterprise resource management. But that's above and beyond really the scope of where we're going with this particular demonstration. And I know there were other demonstrations in this series on using Agile in an enterprise sense with Project Server and Project Online. I believe one of the early kickoff projects from Trusted IT with Alexander discussed that. So if you're of interest with that, I will refer you to other demonstrations. But let's move on. Now we know we're in sprint number 2, and we're getting very close to the end of sprint number 2, and the product owner is looking around and saying, okay, what do I need to get done for sprint number 3? And at this point in time, I would say sprint number 3 is very close to being ready. We have 2 stories assigned to it. The story point estimates have been done, and they add up to 48. Which you can see coincidentally is my velocity of my 2 existing stories, which is my velocity. That's my expectation. I can do 48 story points in a single sprint. So for all intents and purposes, one could say sprint number 3 is ready for handoff to the team. But being agile, being able to let the product owner change his or her mind whenever he or she wants, product owner can look at that and say, you know what, this particular story of student phone number search isn't a high priority story for me. I don't think I want that done in sprint number 3. I'm going to defer that. I'm going to tentatively bookmark that as available for working on in story number or sprint number 4. So we are now reorganizing our product backlog based on the project owner's specific needs at the time. So now sprint number 3 is very tiny. We only have a single story in it, and we have capacity. So now the product owner is going to say, okay, what can I do? What are my high priority stories? So again, we can use the full functionality of Microsoft Project and say, I want to look at all of the high priority stories, for example. So now it's going to say, well, at this point in time, you've addressed all of the high priority stories. So guess you're going to either A, have to do some reprioritization, or you're going to have to look for some other consideration. So we'll restore that. We'll put them all back up again. And now the product owner is going to say, you know what? The team has really been on my case. The team is saying there's a few risk stories out there that I really need to get addressed. I can't put them off any longer. So since I seem to have some capacity in sprint number 3, let's look at the risk stories. Let's try to keep my team happy. And there we go. Student name search. The team has identified that as a risk story. I, the product owner, I'm wearing my product owner's hat right now. I, the product owner, haven't really embraced that. I haven't even given it a priority yet. But the team obviously thinks it's important. The team has already told me what the story point count is going to be. So maybe as the product owner, I'm going to say, okay, I hear you. Let's set that as a high priority. And let's, in fact, put that into sprint number 3. Clear the filters. Whoops, I meant to clear the filter there. Clear the filters. And now let's see what's going on. So now we got 2 stories back into sprint number 3. But now we have another problem. Now we can see that our sprint is way over the velocity. We don't have a hope of ever delivering 64 story points of effort in a single sprint. So again, the product owner needs to go in and pick and choose and understand exactly what's going on as we move forward. And at this point in time, the product owner may say, okay, that risk story isn't going to work. I'm going to move it down to a 4 again. And I'm going to say, what else is out there? What are the stories that are ready? And this is where the process support can come into play. What are the stories that are ready? What stories? And at this point in time, I've clicked my button and nothing has shown up. And I'll show you what should happen here in just a second. So we're saying there are no stories that are actually ready for scheduling into a sprint. So now the product owners, okay, now I need to hurry up my subject matter experts. What are the stories that are in progress? So I click that particular option, and it's going to say, here are the 4 stories that the team is working on. I got the student name search. Yeah, not going to work because I know it's too high. I've got a documentation story, and I've got 2 business stories. So now it's time for me to get out to my subject matter expert saying there's only 3 days left before we're going into sprint plan. I don't have enough stories in my backlog at an appropriate state to actually plan a sprint. So please, please, please progress these stories, get the story card complete, get the definition of done complete. Let's make sure we're putting priorities and story statuses into all of these so that we can get them handed off so that the team can estimation. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the mechanics of how we would progress it forward, but this is just an example of how we can use Microsoft Project to be very, very agile and to do very aggressive product backlog management, story management, and working forward to develop exactly what it is that we want in hand for the next sprint. Now, for those of you who have used other agile tools, you're probably going to say, this is not state of the art. This is not as glamorous as a Jira, as a Rally. They're very much a GUI presentation. I actually have a visual image of a story card, and I can drag it and drop it. And I'll say, absolutely yes. This is based on the existing definition of what Microsoft is. It is, I'm going to say, a text database tool. And therefore, we have to accept the fact that instead of doing a drag and drop, we simply go in and we do a type and we do a refresh and we get exactly the same result. So I think it's just as easy. It's just a slightly different visual that we're going to have for managing stories. Why do I think Microsoft Project is still an awesome tool for being agile in spite of the fact that the GUI is not as state-of-the-art? I believe Microsoft Project is this awesome tool for being agile because we've already invested in Microsoft Project. We've got hundreds and thousands of licenses in our organizations. We have people trained in using the tool. Why do we need to go out and buy another tool, do more training, do more license costs, and have our projects scattered across multiple tools so that as a product manager or a project owner, I may have to be using different tools for different projects I'm working on concurrently? I think there's an absolute simplicity in how we can standardize our project delivery environment. And again, that's the last thing, time willing, that I'm hoping to talk about is the reason that Gartner is saying bi-modal delivery, having a single tool set to support all projects, is so important in the organization. So recognizing that we have this one, I'm going to say deficiency, I like to be very honest and deficiency in the user interface, we have all of the functionality. Now, the other thing I will call to mind, if you participated in the kickoff session where Sargent laid out the roadmap for Microsoft Project, he had some very exciting slides in that presentation. So again, if you haven't seen it and you're very interested in the future direction, I would get into the archives for this virtual conference and have a look at what he presented, because Microsoft is committed to actually changing this user interface, changing the GUI, and absolutely make it state of the art. So I think there's some really exciting things coming. And with this extra functionality and extra support and a change in the GUI, we will be absolutely state of the art with every other Agile tool out there. But in the short term, until Microsoft releases, we have the functionality. We just don't have, I'm going to say, 100% of the GUI presentation. So enough of that. That's product backlog management. The next thing I want to call to your attention is, sorry, I'll quickly go through these buttons as well. Talked about them. This is product owner comes in first thing in the morning, says, what are the new stories? What do I have to accept into my project? We talked about the in progress already. Where can I hurry up my subject matter experts? What are the stories that are ready? I.e., ideally, this should have been highlighted, and we had some stories that the product owner could schedule into the sprint. None existed. What are the stories that are approved? Again, I just don't have anything staged in this particular environment. What are the stories that are story point complete? And these last four are the stories where we're breaking the rules. What stories don't have a story type set? Now, in this particular instance, they're all in the future, so that's not really a concern over time. We certainly need to figure out what these story types are, but probably not huge violations. But if we move on, what are the stories where there's no priority? So we're actually working on stories, but the story priority hasn't been set. Or do we have any stories where there's no release or sprint set? Again, I haven't broken that rule. Or do we have any stories that are actually not sprint ready? And look at that. We have a story that we believe is scheduled for sprint, but we haven't even put a story point estimate on it. So absolutely a lot of good process support to help us be consistent with our application. The next thing I want to share with you is the Scrum Gantt chart itself. One of the other key benefits, I believe, of using Microsoft Project for our Agile projects is it allows us to look at the big picture of projects. Most of the other Agile tools out there in the marketplace are very, very focused on stories, on product backlog management, and on sprint management. And we looked at the functionality we have here in Microsoft Project to do that, but those stories are very much focused just on those aspects, stories, backlog, and sprints. Because we have the full functionality of Microsoft Project available to us, we can also augment our Agile projects to be what I would describe as 100% coverage. So before an Agile project is ever ready to roll into full story development, we need to spend just a little bit of time. There's not a very big timeline out here. It's only about a half a week, but we need to absolutely understand what the vision is, get approval, put together a high-level release strategy, and basically get everybody signed on that this Agile project, yes, it's Agile, and no, we don't know exactly what all the scope is, all the stories are, but we still believe we're going to develop, my example is a student registration system, and we believe our release strategy is the first release is going to be focused on student capture, the second release is going to be focused on validating the student's academic credentials, and the third release is going to be focused on getting the student registered into a program, for example. So we have this little bit of what I would describe as traditional upfront work, and this is also, I would describe as very traditional work. You're going to assign resources to it, and as you can see out here in my Gantt area, you're actually going to create dependencies. So yes, it's only a week long, and yes, you could probably manage this on a napkin, but why bother? Why not use the features of the tool? Now, there are some Agilists out there in the world that say, yes, all of this is important. So what we do is we create a release called Product Vision, and we create a story called Review and Approved Product Vision, and another story called Public Project Product Vision, and so on. So yes, there's ways you can do this in other tools, but I think that's an example of taken the confines of the tool and force fitting a solution where I believe that this is absolutely, absolutely fundamental to being success and absolutely within the absolute confines of what Microsoft Project does so very well. And just to continue on that theme, we have the same strategy for a sprint zero. So if you need to do some environmental setup, some configuration for the environment, again, sprint zero, I think, is another absolute candidate, excuse me, for being traditional, where you're going to set your norms, you're going to determine your velocity, you're going to set your parameters, and you're going to set up your preliminary technology environment. Maybe you need to set up some build servers. Maybe you need to set up some other configurations for your project. Again, yes, you could create another release called Sprint Zero, and you could create stories for all of this, but are you, again, really doing exactly what's needed? And I would suggest no, that some of these things can happen in parallel. Some of these things are absolutely parallel, that you must have the build server installed before you can do, oh, sorry, let's take that backwards, and I don't have a line here. You must have the configuration server configured before you can do the build server, and so on and so on. So there is some absolute, what I would describe as traditional activities in there that Microsoft Project, I believe, supports far, far better than a traditional Agile tool. Oops, that was already expanded, excuse me. Within release, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because I'm really repeating the same message over and over, there is a very small, maybe a day worth of activities that is very traditional, where you're going to confirm the release horizon, you're going to confirm and develop the release strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So some very traditional work up front to develop our release. We have the ability to understand and put details to exactly what happens inside the product backlog, how we're going to do backlog grooming. Now, this degree of granularity, I would suggest, probably would be implemented in very few organizations. We're simply going to say, yes, Steve, we know that we need to do story time and product backlog grooming in our organization. We don't need to individually identify the differences between decomposing epics and prioritizing stories and categorizing stories. And yes, I absolutely agree. The reason I put these into the template for discussion is, again, if you're using this in an enterprise world and you're using task and or timesheet functionality in an enterprise world to capture all of this information onto individuals' timesheets, then we can remind Joe, who happens to be our product owner, and we can confirm or remind Mary and John, who happen to be my subject matter experts, that they need to be reserving a little bit of time every week to get into the product backlog and doing things like decomposing the epics and prioritizing the stories. And we can also, if we're tracking at that level of detail, begin to run metrics. After our third and our fourth Agile project, because we have all of the metrics available, we can then start to understand that we're spending far, far too much time removing stories. We've created too big of a wide open play space, blue sky, that there's so many stories being introduced into our Agile projects that they're just not reasonable. So again, probably never implement at this level of granularity in most organizations, but we can leverage the tool. Maybe we want to only have a single line that's called backlog grooming and track the time we're doing at that so we can develop metrics. Again, enough of that. Then we move into individual sprints. And again, very, very short, 4 hours worth of work to do sprint plan part 1. Very, very short, 4 hours of work to do sprint plan part 2. You can do it at that level of detail and put it on timesheets so you can do metrics, or you can simply choose to not do it at all. That's the key, is pick the degree of functionality that's available inside Microsoft Project that allows you to be agile in the fashion that your organization wants to be agile, and then implement it. The beauty of Microsoft Project is it's a very rich, fully functional tool, and we do absolutely exactly what we want and only what we want. The last thing I really want to call out before we move on and look at the reports is the actual scheduling of the stories themselves. So here we are, we're in sprint number 1, or let's move down to sprint number 2 because that's the one that's still active. expand this. Sprint number 2. These are the red Burning Man indicators that I talked about a moment ago. I'm in sprint number 2. I'm actively working on it. I have my resources assigned, and that's why I have my burning indicator. And I know that my work is being completed over a 2-week window. And I have generically said that validating the student is registered, that's the big one. I want my entire team working on that. So this is where the daily scrum is absolutely going to come in, and they're going to self-manage and figure out what's going on. But these second 2, the credentials and the specialty study, are much more minor stories. And I believe that Juan is probably able to do those on his own. You'll notice I really have no dependency set between this. So this is absolutely allowing my team to self-manage. The only dependency is from a pure scheduling viewpoint, that I'm going to say these stories start when the sprint starts, and these stories end when the sprint ends. And that's really the only, I would say, traditional Microsoft project functionality that I use. But the main message I want to call out is these are the same lines in my Microsoft project schedule that I looked at a moment ago when I was doing my product backlog management. So if we look at lines 95, 96, and 97, and we go back to my product backlog, lines 95, 96, and 97 are exactly the same. And that's the key distinction that I mentioned early in my discussion. The Scrum Gantt chart is a very much traditional Microsoft project Gantt chart, but it has an extra filter built into it so that we're aware of what stories are active and being scheduled, so they're going to show up on that Gantt chart, and what stories are still in flight, and they're not even going to be burdened. We're not going to worry about scheduling. We're not going to worry about anything. We're going to treat these in a very agile fashion. So that's it. The last thing I would make reference to, and just one last quick reference to the Sprint Gantt chart, is I haven't fleshed it out at all, but one thing that I believe, again, most of the Agile tools are fairly light on, is what happens for a release. Agile is very, very visible that every sprint needs to be production ready. It needs to be completely done. But it also recognizes that we're not going to do implementation at the end of every sprint, because there's a significant amount of overhead and organizational upheaval when we do implementations, which is why we have this principle of releases. And generally, most Agilists say, and when you get to release, you need to follow organizational policies. Well, again, that doesn't fit into product backlog and stories very well, but it absolutely fits into the into the Microsoft project world very, very well, because now we can say, in order to do a release, we must do a system test, a acceptance test, a stress and performance test, a disaster recovery test. We must do documentation. We must do training. So anything and everything that your organization would traditionally do as part of a release, we can absolutely schedule it in. We can bring in other team members who are not part of the core Agile team. We can schedule it. We can put dependencies. We can even put constraints and deadlines on it. So we can manage those 2 or 3 weeks of a release as a very traditional focused activity following organizational processes, and still be very, very agile. And just a very quick aside on that, the other comment I'll make is, because we're using Microsoft Project for being agile, we can absolutely also use this in a hybrid environment. As a matter of fact, I delivered a very large project. If you haven't caught my accent yet, I'm a Canadian. I'm actually from the east coast of Canada. And I managed a project for our local lottery up here, where we're rolling slot machines, VLTs, out to all of the bars. It was a very large project. It was about $300 million of project. And a significant amount of my project was what I would describe as a traditional waterfall project, which was the actual preparing of and staging of those slot machines, because it was very heavily controlled, very heavily regulated. We had to get all kinds of government approvals and sign-offs and confirmations that the payout tables were appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely a traditional project. But then we also had a very significant business intelligence reporting component of our project that was managed in an absolute agile fashion. So I would have a lot of my project, and this is not my BLT project by any stretch of the imagination, but I would have hundreds and thousands of lines in my schedule that was traditional development. And then I would have a series in the very same schedule that was, and here are the 6 reports that my BI team is going to work on for the next 2 weeks. And then we'll do a sprint retrospective and a sprint review, and then we'll find another 10 BI reports based on my velocity that the team is going to work on. And all of that worked in absolute perfect harmony across a single project schedule, combining both agile and traditional. So enough of that. I'm quickly running out of time here. So I do want to move on and quickly show you the reports. I had some screenshots of this going into on my PowerPoint. Agile is all about burn down reports. So we have obviously built in a burn down report inside Microsoft Project. It may look a lot like the burn down report that you see from Microsoft when you open up Project 2013, but it's actually a much more focused burn down report. It knows what the date is, and yes, my data is historical. My project is actually in March. You probably saw that in the project timeline as well, but it knows what my current date is. Today is March the 3rd, believe it or not, and March the 5th, excuse me, and it knows what stories are part of the current sprint, and therefore it is going to select only those stories that are in the current sprint and only report those on the report, as opposed to some of the other traditional reports that simply take all tasks in a Microsoft project schedule and burn them down. So we can do burn down stories. If you do task assignments and assign the stories to team members, then you can use the functionality of Microsoft Project, which absolutely understands work and effort, and burn down the work on work as well. Or if you're glass half empty versus half full, you can burn down or burn up the work. The other thing we have available is I would describe as a project-wide burn down, burn up charts. So using the functionality of the awesome reporting tool available inside Project, we can simply go in and say, what are we interested in? Do we want to see all stories across all releases? Do we want to see only the stories that happened inside a specific part of a release? And we can absolutely do all of the selectivity that we want to be very aggressive and very dynamic with how we are rolling out and managing our project. And finally, because we have all of the functionality of Microsoft Project available to us, we can go in and do traditional planning as well. So again, whether this is my hybrid project rolling out BLTs, where I have some traditional and some non-traditional agile work, or whether this is a purely agile project and I'm taking advantage of the fact that I'm able to track milestones, I'm able to track my percent completes across my phases. I can see that my product vision is done, and I am in release number 1, and at this point I'm projecting I'm 31% complete. So we have the ability to do that. If you're cost managed within Microsoft Project because you have all of your resources assigned and you have all of the costs associated with, you can get detailed cost tracking inside a Microsoft Project environment. Or what I really like is I can track my resource consumption. And again, this is all predicated on that you make the decision to assign your resources to your stories, and you don't have to. I can track and see how well my resources are being utilized. Now, we have a dip right here where John and Mary and Kim aren't doing near as much work as the rest of the team, which could be an absolute warning indicator for my project. Or in this particular instance, I'm going to say, no, it's not, because these, if you remember, I mentioned earlier, are my subject matter experts. So I'm certainly not expecting them to be as busy as my core team members. So bottom line is, we have the ability to be very agile, and we have the ability to leverage all of the features and functions of Microsoft Project. Now, I am very quickly reaching to the point where I want to take questions, but I do want to go back to my PowerPoint for just one quick second. We already talked about all of that. And I want to talk about the fact that we have the ability to track and manage epics as well as tasks within individual stories. So again, if you want to say I have an epic, which is very, very, very common in Agile, business always starts talking in terms of epics first, and then it takes a little bit of work to decompose them into stories. So Business identified an epoch of student address, and over time, that epoch gets decomposed into stories, and we can see that some of our stories have already been scheduled, and as a fact are complete because we're now in sprint number 2, and some of these stories are yet to be ever envisioned, may never get completed, or certainly will be completed over time. If your organization chooses to decompose stories into tasks, again, this is where the power and functionality of Microsoft Project really shines. We take our story, validate the student is registered, and we simply decompose it and say, this story has a child called, and I know my tasks are not very imaginative, validate the student is registered dash coding, and validate the student is registered dash design. We can do the decomposition. And that, although I haven't done it in this particular example, may be where you want to do the task assignments and assign work. And finally, if you want to use the tool to drive your discussions in your daily stand-up, we have a current sprint status report, a view that says, okay, today, this is what's going on. We have 2 stories that are in coding. We have 1 story that's in design. We have 1 story that's in QA, and we have 1 story that's in testing. Team, how well are we doing? What are your plans for the next 24 hours? What did you do for the last 24 hours? And still follow all of the traditional Agile principles, but support whatever level of detail and whatever level of planning we want in the tool. And very, very quickly, and I know my focus is on project on the desktop, and I know I'm running out of time, I do want to mention, I believe this really, really shines when we move it into the enterprise environment, so PWA, whether it's Project Server or Project Online, because these are simply schedules in Microsoft Project, they can be published to PWA. Doesn't matter that it's an Agile project, it's simply a schedule. And we have also created identical views inside PWA so that you can do exactly the same management. So for example, all through this, you may have been thinking, Steve, this is great functionality, but I'm not sure I want to let my product owners have Microsoft Project Desktop licenses because it's a little too powerful for them, nor do I necessarily want to spend the money on Microsoft Project licenses for my product owner. If you have PWA, awesome. All you do is you set your product owner loose inside PWA, and they use the product backlog. They use the epics. They use the views, identical functionality in PWA to do that functionality. We have the same level of reports available. We can do burn down and burn up reports inside PWA. And the important thing, and I will close off with this slide and take time for questions, as Gartner describes, it's important that organizations move towards a consolidated environment where all projects, in this case, Agile and traditional projects, are fully integrated. So within my project center, I have all projects available, whether it's a traditional project, whether it's a support project, whether it's an Agile project. It is simply a project inside PWA. My Agile projects can then leverage all of the functionality of PWA to have project sites, to track action items, to store project documents, to store story cards if they so desire. And we have full enterprise management. All work assigned to all team members, whether it is Agile, and these 2 guys that I have highlighted here are Agile tasks, or if they're traditional tasks from traditional projects or traditional tasks within my hybrid environment, my team members get a full view of everything they need to do across their work assignments on a week-by-week basis. So with that, I will pause and take time for any questions that folks may have in our remaining, I would say, about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Steve. That was very informative. So I don't see any questions in the chat window. I think people are trying to digest the information. So one question of my own is, so this is pretty much basically you have Sensei has an add-on that can be added to project, but like you mentioned, a lot of it could be just configured using views and filters and all that, right?
Correct. This is 100% doable by anyone in the audience.
Right.
All these are views. Product backlog is a view. If I go to my view window, it is a view with a specific filter and a specific group.
Great.
Nothing magical there.
Y- yes. And the there used to be a solution starter for agile projects
Yes.
before 2010.
Yes.
Uh, so is that what is this your app built on, or is it something more enhanced, or
It's certain. It. That was the origins of this, but we have certainly augmented it with a significant number. For example, all of these fields are extra custom fields that we've added to allow us to track and manage and be extremely agile with our passions. But that was the genesis of this for sure.
okay, very good. All right, I think that's pretty much it. We are at the 5 minute mark. So at this point, Steve, I would end this session. And since you have shared your contact details, I'm pretty sure folks will contact you if they have more questions.
Absolutely.
And thank you for your time this morning.
I will thank everyone on the call for their time.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye now.